School. Film study professor Joe Fortunato on board with us again on a Friday morning. 93.5, 1590 WAKR. And this morning we're going back to where it all began with Agent 007. I'm going to let Joe kind of take it from there. Here's Joe Fortunato. Joe, take us back to the early 60s, my friend.
Yes, as that unmistakable music tells us, we're going to talk James Bond today. So good morning, Ray. Good morning, everybody. And we're going back to the birth of Bond, Dr. No, the first James Bond film, celebrating its 60th anniversary, released on October 5th, May 8th, 1963 in the United States. It was actually released quite a bit earlier in October of 1962 in London, but the movie's United States release was actually stalled because of the political climate going on with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So a little bit of interesting history there. Directed by Terrence Young, starring, of course, Sean Connery, Ursula Andress, and Joseph Weisman. This was chosen as the first James Bond film in the franchise because the plot in the source novel was pretty straightforward. It only had one major location and only one big special effects set piece, so they thought they'd kind of start easy, as it were, with Dr. No. And the famous line, Bond, James Bond, was voted number 22 by the AFI all-time movie quotes. Ian Fleming, the writer of the James Bond series, didn't really originally like the casting of Sean Connery, because Connery was, he was Scottish, he was from a working class background, and the James Bond that he had written and created was English and more upper class background. But after seeing the film, he decided, of course, that Connery was perfectly cast. Producer Albert Vicoli, one of the original producers, cast Sean Connery. They wanted him because he was big, tough-looking guy, but nonetheless moved gracefully like a cat. And of course, he checked with his wife to see if indeed Sean Connery had sex appeal, and she said yes. So Sean Connery was cast in the role. Roger Moore actually was considered as the original James Bond. Of course, he would go on to play James Bond in the 70s, but it went to Sean Connery in that famous role.
Yeah, you know, when you look at casting, too, in Dr. No, because I love this movie, it's very interesting because we've seen the role of Felix, right, Joe, played by various actors throughout the years, but Jack Lord was the original Felix.
Yeah, and Jack Lord did it for, I believe, 2 films, and they kind of thought that he was upstaging Bond a little bit, so they recast him. So Jack Lord would go on to, great things on TV with Hawaii Five-0, but he was originally Felix Leiter, which is Bond's U.S. counterpart, Contact. A couple things about this first James Bond here. It was the only James Bond film not to have a pre-title sequence. It goes right into the opening, in that famous opening of the gun barrel shooting a picture of James Bond pointing his gun at the camera. That was originally designed at the last minute using a pinhole camera through a real gun barrel. And the actor in that sequence is not Sean Connery, but a stuntman. Connery didn't actually film that opening gun barrel sequence until a few films later in Thunderball. One of the most famous images of this film is Ursula Andress playing Honey Ryder emerging from the sea. Is very iconic scene in her bikini there. Very famous to this day. Andress has said that she still would get that all those years later. All I did was wear a bikini, she said, not even a small one, and whoosh, overnight I made it. And in fact, that was paid homage to later in other Bond films where actresses such as Halle Berry would come out wearing a similar bathing suit as Ursula Andress did. You talked about casting in Dr. No. Ian Fleming actually wanted his cousin, Christopher Lee, the famous horror film actor, to play the role of Dr. No. They also asked Noel Coward. They both turned down the part. Max von Sydow turned it down so he could play Jesus Christ in The Greatest Story Ever Told. And it ended up going to Joseph Weisman. Another interesting fact of who knows what might have happened in history is in 2019, Cary Grant's daughter revealed that her father wanted or regretted turning down the role of James Bond. So apparently he must have been offered or at least discussed. I think he would have been a little bit too old at that period of time, but, he would have been a great Bond in the 50s or the 40s. And this just amuses me. In Japan, when, of course, this film would go worldwide, the translators in Japan interpreted the title of Dr. No as Doctor, ? No, ! Which meant, we don't want a doctor. And that was discovered at the last minute, and they fixed it so they could go ahead with their marketing.
Joe, how did this movie do? Because you mentioned this was the first one. How did this movie do at the box office and financially? Of course, it led into 60 years of 007 movies. But was it well received at the box office?
Yes, generally it was. And that wasn't a given because, as you said, they didn't really know what they had or if it was going to play, which is one of the reasons I mentioned a few minutes ago that they chose sort of a streamlined, more simpler plot to go with this. And Sean Connery, of course, it is common, signed on for a couple of films when they signed this contract. But they didn't really know what they had until it was released and did pretty well and, of course, spawned, as you said, 60 years of Bond films, some of them classics, some not so much, but certainly probably, I guess we'd almost have to say it's the most successful film genre of all time, given the number of I don't want to call them sequels because they're all individual, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, it's certainly a great franchise when you look at 60 years of Bond films. Joe Fortunato, film study professor, has taken us to film school once again on this Friday morning. Joe, great stuff as always, my friend. Look forward to our visit again next Friday. Thank you for the time.
Thanks, Ray. Goodbye, everybody.
There you go. Joe Fortunato taking us to film school. Dr. No from 1963. The latest with the Bond films, by the way, they still haven't announced who the next James Bond will be. Daniel Craig's last one was a few years back. 22 minutes after 8 o'clock. 93.5, 1590 WAKR.